Today, we're going to do something a little different. We're going to hack the hackers. We're going to dive into a completely new way of thinking about digital defense, one that goes way beyond just reacting to alerts and starts to actively think and act like the very people we're trying to stop.
So let's start with a big question, right? The one that probably keeps a lot of people up at night. Companies are pouring millions, sometimes billions of dollars into security, and yet you still see these massive company-ending data breaches in the headlines almost every week. How is that possible? It feels like a total paradox, but the answer? Well, it's a lot similar than you might think.
See, here's the thing. It's not that the tools are bad. Actually, most modern security platforms are incredibly good at finding individual problems. An exposed file over here, a weak password over there, a misconfigured setting. They can see all the individual trees, no problem. The issue is they're completely missing the forest.
And that is the absolute heart of it. A single, small misconfiguration, on its own, it might be a pretty low-level risk. But what happens when an attacker can chain 2 or 3 or 4 of those little things together? All of a sudden, it's not a list of problems anymore. It's a story. It's an attack path. The real failure isn't in spotting the issues. It's in missing the story they tell together.
So what happens when you miss that story? Well, you end up with a huge problem that plagues the entire industry: alert fatigue. Just imagine being on a security team and you're getting thousands of these little low-context alerts every single day. It's the digital version of the boy who cried wolf. After a while, it all just becomes noise. And spotting the real threat, well, it's almost impossible.
Okay, so let's look at this side by side. The old way, it just creates a ton of noise. You get a simple alert like, hey, an S3 storage bucket is public. Okay, is that bad? Is it critical? Who knows? But the new way, it gives you crystal clear context. It tells you a story. It says this public bucket, combined with this specific user permission over here, creates a direct 3-step path to taking over the entire account. Now that is an alert you can't possibly ignore.
To really see that full story, you have to fundamentally shift your perspective. This isn't about ticking off boxes on some compliance checklist anymore. It's about learning to think like an attacker, to actively hunt for those hidden pathways and chains of weakness that they live to exploit. And this brings us to the core concept here: attack path analysis. It's a method that's all about intelligently connecting the dots. It finds those seemingly harmless little issues, the individual trees, and it maps out how they connect to form a full-blown attack path. It shows you the entire forest, and more importantly, the trail an attacker would take right through it. Let me make this super real for you. Here's a classic attack path. Step 1, an attacker finds a public storage bucket. Okay, not great, but maybe not a 5-alarm fire. Step 2, inside that bucket, they find some leaked credentials. Getting worse. Step 3, they realize those credentials belong to a user with an overly permissive IAM role. That's identity and access management, by the way. So this user can do way more than they should be able to. And boom, step 4, they can now get in and start pulling out sensitive data. Any one of those steps on its own might be a low-priority ticket, but together, that's a critical breach just waiting to happen. This one phrase really captures the entire shift in thinking. We're moving away from just detecting isolated problems to actually simulating the breach before it has a chance to happen. It's the very definition of being proactive. So if we're going to start simulating breaches, how do we measure the risk? You can't use the old yardsticks. This calls for a whole new set of metrics, a completely new way of thinking. Let's open up the Threat Hunters Toolkit. Okay, here's a question that your traditional security tools just have no answer for. You find a problem, sure, but what does that mean in the real world? Would it take a team of state-sponsored hackers months to crack it? Or could some kid in a basement with a script exploit it in the next 5 minutes? Knowing the answer to that changes everything. And this is where 2 crucial ideas come in. First, you've got time to detect, or TTD. That's a measure of your team's speed. But then you have time to exploit, or TTE, and that's a measure of the attacker's speed. The real danger zone, the critical blind spot, is any time the attacker's TTE is shorter than your TTD. That's the stuff you have to fix right now, because they'll get to it before you even know it's there. And next up, we have to totally rethink how we score risk. Forget just technical severity. We need to calculate the blast radius. This is a score that measures the potential business impact. How sensitive is the data they could get? Could this let an attacker jump from one cloud account to another? Could it expose you to massive regulatory fines? This helps you prioritize fixing the things that would cause the most damage. And where do the best, most realistic tests come from?
Real life, of course. The most powerful security platforms build their tests by reverse engineering famous, real-world breaches. You simulate the exact tactics used in the Capital One hack or the Uber hack. That way, you're not just preparing for some theoretical threat, you're preparing for what you know works out in the wild.
All right, so let's take all of these ideas and just crank the stakes way, way up. Let's see how this approach works when you're not just securing a company, but when you're securing government infrastructure, sovereign clouds, when national security is on the line. Because when you make that jump from protecting a business to protecting a country, the margin for error it completely disappears. Every single connection, every permission, every little setting has to be looked at through this aggressive new lens. This is where an idea called zero trust architecture becomes completely non-negotiable. The principle behind it is so simple. Never trust, always verify. It's not just a slogan, it means you implement concrete security pillars across everything. Identity, devices, networks, data. You basically assume that a breach isn't just possible, but that it's likely, and you build your defenses from the ground up with that in mind. So, how does a security platform connect to an environment that's sensitive? Very, very carefully. The whole game is about least privilege. You use temporary, read-only roles, you never store credentials, and you make sure every single action is logged and can be revoked in an instant. It's about getting the visibility you need to find the attack paths without creating a new one in the process. Okay, so let's pull all of this together. What does this really mean for the future? Well, it's a huge change in how we think about security. We're moving away from being passive defenders and becoming active, prepared hunters. Ultimately, this whole thing represents a shift in the one big question we should be asking. For years, security was all about compliance. The question was, are we compliant? Did we check all the boxes? The new and frankly much more important question is, are we secure against a real-world attack? One is about process. The other is about survival. And this quote just wraps it all up perfectly. It's about building a system that thinks like a hacker, that sees the world as a web of attack paths, and that operates on a foundation of zero trust. Honestly, this is the new standard for how digital defense has to work. Which, of course, leaves us with one final, fascinating question to think about. This is always a game of cat and mouse, right? So as our defenses get better and better at simulating the attacks we know about, the attackers, they're not just going to give up, they're going to evolve. So the real question is, what's their next move?